Dying wasn't always the result of combat. Dying was often something worse, an impersonal decision, a faceless order, an act as cold as it was precise. Dying could be a signature on a piece of paper sealed in blood, a name whispered under torture, a suspicious glance. Millions died, but millions more didn't die. They were eliminated. Industrial methods, systems designed to erase, to disappear. Men, women, babies. Branded Jews, hunted partisans, humiliated deserters, massacred prisoners. At the hands of the laughing SS, the NKVD pointing at the back of their heads, the Japanese testing their sabers on living flesh, Allied commandos who wanted no prisoners, and lynching mobs with glee. They were lined up and shot like cattle, hung from lampposts in squares, their throats cut for training, gassed in mobile trucks, buried alive, used for practice, incinerated without a name. Execution was order, punishment, spectacle, ethnic cleansing, bureaucratic sadism. It was planned death, sentencing without defense, extermination with payroll, crime with an official seal. In total war, death ceased to be human, and the executioner always wore a uniform and a human face. Execution with Katana. The Pacific Theater was the scene of some of the most brutal and ruthless episodes of the conflict. Among them, one stands out for its archaic violence, its symbolism of power and terror, and the way it combined samurai tradition with imperial fanaticism. The katana executions carried out by Japanese officers against prisoners of war. These acts, recorded on multiple fronts, from the Philippines to Burma, from New Guinea to China, were not mere outbursts of individual cruelty, but expressions of a military culture deeply imbued with extreme nationalism, contempt for the enemy, and a distorted sense of honor. The katana, the traditional curved samurai sword, was more than a weapon. In the Japanese imagination, it represented the soul of the warrior. During the rise of Japanese militarism in the 1930s, this tradition was incorporated as a symbol of hierarchy, discipline, and nationalist mystique. Imperial army officers carried katanas as part of their dress uniform and often also in combat. It was not unusual for high-ranking officers to commission custom blades, some forged by master swordsmiths, others mass-produced to supply the troops. However, this exaltation of the katana as a symbol of warrior honor shifted toward a sinister use, the execution of prisoners of war. Public beheadings carried out with katanas as a method of terror were documented during the campaigns in China, especially during the Nanjing massacre in 1937. These practices intensified after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the war against the Allies became all-out and disregard for enemy life became institutionalized. The brutality of these executions cannot be understood without understanding the ideological framework within which they took place. The Imperial Japanese Army spread among its troops a distorted version of the Bushido Code, the ancient way of the warrior, which exalted sacrifice, loyalty to the emperor, and the acceptance of one's own death as the supreme expression of virtue. In this context, surrender was seen as the ultimate dishonor, and prisoners of war, especially Westerners, were considered cowards unworthy of compassion. This disdain translated into inhumane conditions in prisoner-of-war camps, forced marches like the one at Bataan, and in many cases, summary executions. Among the methods used, hanging, bayoneting, and firing squad, beheading with a katana became a practice charged with theatricality and symbolic message. It not only eliminated the enemy, but did so in a manner reminiscent of feudal tradition and intended to restore the absolute authority of the Japanese soldier. One of the most infamous episodes related to these executions was the beheading of Allied prisoners on the island of New Guinea. Numerous testimonies from captured Australian soldiers describe how their comrades were taken from the prisoner-of-war camp, forced to kneel, and then beheaded in front of the rest of the group. Sometimes the heads were mounted on spikes or displayed as trophies, a gesture intended to instill terror. In the Philippines, during the American retreat and the fall of Corregidor, Japanese officers used their swords to execute surrendering enemy officers in open violation of the Geneva Conventions. In some cases, mass beheading sessions were held, where prisoners were executed one after another before rows of Japanese soldiers watching as part of a victory ceremony. British Army Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Lyon was executed with a katana after being captured. His head was mounted on a stake and displayed for days as a warning to Allied guerrillas. These actions were approved and sometimes directly ordered by high-ranking officers, who saw them as a way to reinforce discipline, obedience, and terror toward the enemy. In Japan, even the media celebrated this type of violence. In December 1937, during the campaign in China, two Japanese officers, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, were the protagonists of a beheading competition on the road to Nanjing. They competed to see who could behead 100 Chinese people first, using their swords. The Tokyo daily Nichi Nichi Shimbun covered the story as if it were a sporting event. After the war, both officers were tried for war crimes and executed. This case symbolizes the degree of dehumanization achieved by imperial army officers. What the press viewed as a spectacle of virility and military efficiency would, for posterity, be seen as a pathological example of the ritualized use of violence within the Japanese military establishment. With Japan's defeat in 1945, many of these crimes came to light through survivor testimonies, photographs, diaries, and officers' confessions. In the Tokyo trials and in Allied military tribunals held in Asia, Katana beheadings resulted in multiple convictions. Some officers attempted to justify their actions as part of the line of duty or a form of just punishment for enemy soldiers. Others claimed they were acting under superior orders. In many cases, the perpetrators were sentenced to death or long prison terms. However, the magnitude of the crimes and the lack of systematic record-keeping prevented all of them from being brought to trial. Some high-ranking officers, such as General Tomoyuki Yamashita, were held accountable for the conduct of their subordinates and executed under the principle of command responsibility. The image of the Japanese officer raising his katana to execute a prisoner became one of the most enduring symbols of the savagery of the war in Asia. Photographs and accounts of these scenes filled the Allied press and served as war propaganda, reinforcing the image of the enemy as cruel and fanatical. However, beyond their propaganda use, these actions left a profound mark on the memories of veterans, victims, and 20th century military history. The shot in the back of the head. One of the coldest and most systematic methods of extermination was execution by shooting in the back of the head, used recurrently by the Soviets, especially by the NKVD, the feared Stalinist political police. This method responded not only to a logic of efficiency and silence, but also to a profoundly dehumanizing vision of the enemy, who must be eliminated without a trace. Its most atrocious and well-known symbol, the Katyn forest. The shot through the back of the head was not an improvisation or a last-minute solution. It was a carefully thought-out technique, perfected in the cellars of the Lubyanka in Moscow, in the dungeons of Kharkiv, in the tunnels of Minsk, and in the forests of Smolensk. The executioners were trained to shoot without hesitation, silently, without looking at the face of the executed. Their weapon of choice, the Walter PPK pistol, ironically of German manufacture, which allowed for an accurate and lethal shot without too much noise. The victims were led one by one, forced to kneel or bend over a ditch, and there, with a brutality repeated thousands of times, they received a bullet in the base of the skull. The body was dragged away, covered, and the next one came along. The most emblematic example of this practice was the Katyn massacre, perpetrated in the spring of 1940. More than 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, police officers, teachers, doctors, engineers, and civil servants were executed on the orders of the Soviet Politburo, signed by Stalin and Beria. The victims had been taken prisoner after the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, when the Red Army, pursuant to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, occupied the east of the country. The prisoners were concentrated in camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, interrogated for months and then transferred in small groups to secret locations where the liquidation order would be carried out. The method was ruthlessly systematic. At Katyn, NKVD officers headed by Vasily Blokhin worked night shifts. Blokhin, dressed in a leather apron, long gloves, and a cap, personally executed more than 7,000 men, one after another, for weeks. According to Soviet testimony declassified decades later, he could kill up to 300 men a night. The prisoners were taken to a soundproof room, where they were ordered to say their names. Two officers then held them by the arms and head, and Blokhin shot. The body was thrown through a trapdoor into a corridor where other officers dragged it to a communal ditch. The bodies were buried in mass graves in the nearby forests, mainly in Katyn, but also in Mednoye, Kalinin, and Kharkiv. For years, the crime remained hidden. No one was supposed to know. Families waited for letters that never arrived. In Poland, children grew up without parents, without explanation, while the Soviet regime wove a web of lies to hide what had happened. When German troops discovered the graves in Katyn in 1943, after occupying Smolensk, they ordered an international forensic investigation. It was clearly established that the murders had occurred in 1940, when the area was under Soviet control. But the world was at war, and the Allies, including Britain and the United States, were unwilling to confront their ally Stalin about it. For decades, the Soviet Union denied responsibility. They claimed the Germans had committed the crimes in 1941, despite overwhelming documentary and forensic evidence to the contrary. The Katyn victims became a symbol of Polish grief, of the enforced silence, of the humiliation suffered not only by the dead, but by an entire nation unable to grieve. It wasn't until 1990 that the Soviet government, now under Mikhail Gorbachev, officially acknowledged its responsibility for the massacres. Documents were handed over, exhumations were permitted, and a slow, incomplete process of commemoration began. But Katyn was not an isolated case. Executions by shooting in the back of the head were a common tool of the NKVD throughout the war. In the Soviet-occupied territories, Western Ukraine, the Baltic states, Eastern Belarus, thousands of people were arrested for counter-revolutionary activities or simply for belonging to suspicious social classes. Many were taken to damp basements, interrogated under torture, and executed in secret. Shooting in the back of the head made it possible to quickly eliminate large numbers of people without the need for mass shootings that might generate resistance or empathy among soldiers. The method also had a symbolic component. The victim was not to look at her executioner. She was stripped of her face, her dignity, her history. The shot to the back of the head, executed in silence, was an absolute denial of the enemy, a way of erasing them from the world and from memory. There was no judgment, no screams, no explanation, just a sharp click, one body falling and another dragging it from the scene. In many cases, as in the prisons of Lviv or Vilna, the bodies were thrown into wells or mass graves sealed with lime, where relatives would never find them. In parallel, the Soviets also used these techniques against their own soldiers. Thousands of Red Army members considered deserters, traitors, or suspected of ideological contamination were summarily executed by military discipline committees. In the rear of the front, special NKVD units such as the Zagrads Otriadi, blocking detachments, were ordered to shoot any soldiers who retreated without a direct order. Repression was not only directed at the external enemy, it was an integral part of the total control mechanism that governed Soviet life during wartime. Unlike Nazi crimes, which were documented in lurid detail and tried at Nuremberg, many Soviet crimes went unpunished or shrouded in a dense blanket of political silence. The USSR emerged from the war as the victorious power, and the horror of the Holocaust eclipsed, in terms of international visibility, the crimes perpetrated by Stalin. However, the archives declassified after the fall of the communist regime made it possible to clearly reconstruct the magnitude of these crimes. The mobile gas chambers. One of the most vicious was the use of mobile gas chambers, known in German as Gaswagen or Sonderwagen. These modified trucks were used by the Third Reich to murder tens of thousands of people, mainly Jews, Roma, the disabled, and Soviet prisoners, in a silent, efficient, and deliberately covert manner. The concept of mobile gas chambers arose within the framework of the Nazi euthanasia program Action T4, which began in 1939 and aimed to eliminate those deemed lives unworthy of life. The principal inventor of this technology was Dr. August Becker, an SS chemist working directly under Reinhard Heydrich and Arthur Neber, leader of Einsatzgruppe B. Becker was responsible for the technical design and commissioning of the first modified vehicles, ensuring that the carbon monoxide from the engines was redirected into the sealed cargo compartment. His task was not only to eliminate the victims, but to do so in an efficient manner and with minimal psychological impact on the executioners. The first gas trucks operated under the T4 program, but their use rapidly expanded to the occupied territories of the East after the Soviet invasion in 1941. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile death squads, encountered logistical and moral difficulties in carrying out daily mass shootings. A cleaner method was sought. Thus, the gas trucks were born, a seemingly innocent vehicle that became a death chamber during its journey. Externally, the gas wagon resembled a normal truck, often bearing Wehrmacht insignia or civilian camouflage to avoid suspicion. Internally, the cargo area was hermetically sealed. Engine exhaust gases, rich in carbon monoxide, were redirected into it through a pipe connected under the floor. In some models, the compartment was lined with metal to prevent leaks and had mechanisms to prevent victims from hitting the walls forcefully from within. The procedure was simple and sinister. The victims, who often believed they were being transferred to labor camps or simply relocated, were led into the truck. Sometimes they were forced to strip naked for disinfection and violently shoved into the compartment. The rear doors were double locked and the engine started. The truck slowly drove away, often toward forests or pre-prepared mass graves, while the tube expelled the poisonous gases directly into the compartment. Within minutes, the air became unbreathable. The victims began to cough, vomit, despair, scratch the metal walls, and slam against each other in a spiral of collective asphyxiation. They died in the darkness, amid screams, shoves, and convulsions. Once the journey was completed, which usually took between 10 and 20 minutes depending on the number of people, temperature, and condition of the vehicle, the executioners opened the rear doors. A dense mixture of gases and the smell of vomit and feces emerged from inside. The bodies were found piled on top of each other, often with clenched hands and skin marked by their final attempts to breathe. A special team was tasked with dragging the corpses out of the truck, inspecting them for valuables, and dumping them in ditches or mass graves. The horror didn't end there. The gas wagon were reused multiple times a day. Sometimes the bodies were still warm when the truck was sent back to retrieve a new load of victims. The stench permeated the walls. The drivers and operators, often members of the SS or specialized technicians, reported nausea, nightmares, and, in some cases, wished to be transferred to other destinations. But the orders were clear. Meet the extermination quota, Chelmno extermination camp in Poland. There, between December 1941 and July 1944, at least 152,000 people were murdered, most of them by gas trucks. Chelmno was a laboratory of horror. The trucks were tested, modified, and calibrated. Asphyxiation times were measured, routes were tested, and even calculations were made of how many people could stand up without being crushed before dying. According to recovered documents and testimonies from the operators themselves, some of these trucks could hold up to 50 to 70 people per load, although cases were documented where more than 100 were loaded. The deaths were violent and often not instantaneous. In cold temperatures, the gas took longer to take effect. Screams, blows, and the sound of falling bodies echoed inside the vehicle as it moved slowly along rural roads, which had become death rows. Becker's reports sent to the High Command included technical recommendations, such as improving insulation to prevent escapes or reducing the number of passengers to hasten the death. In a letter dated 1942, he suggested limiting the load to 40 people to avoid excessive damage to the vehicle and facilitate subsequent cleanup. The industrialization of crime reached a point of chilling cynicism here. The discussion wasn't about murder, but rather about how to make it more optimal. Although stationary gas chambers like those at Auschwitz and Treblinka eventually replaced mobile trucks in terms of the volume of extermination carried out, gas wagons never ceased to operate completely. They were used until the final months of the war, especially for mass executions in rural areas where fixed facilities had not been built. They were also used against Soviet prisoners of war and political opponents. After the war, many of those responsible for these crimes were brought to trial. August Becker testified at the Frankfurt trials in 1960, admitting to having overseen the construction and operation of the trucks. He never showed any real remorse. Many operators, however, were never brought to trial, shielded by the anonymity provided by the murderous bureaucracy of the Nazi regime. Mobile gas vans represent one of the most monstrous faces of the Shoah, a killing machine disguised as a vehicle, a technical solution to a genocidal ideology. Unlike the gas chambers in the camps, their mobility made them even more sinister. They could arrive in any village, any ghetto, any prison camp, transform an ordinary street into a rolling slaughterhouse, and then leave behind only corpses, silence, and smoke. Remembering them isn't just a matter of history, it's an act of justice. Every cog in these vehicles, every screw, every hose, and every sealed door was part of a machine built to exterminate innocent people. Knowing it, telling it, and not forgetting it is the only antidote to the forgetting that allows horror to be repeated. The hanging. Hanging, it wasn't just a means of eliminating political enemies, resistance fighters, Jews, or prisoners of war. It was also a psychological tool, a warning, a ritual of public terror. Unlike other, more occult methods such as firing squads or gassing, hanging had a staged dimension. It was a deliberately visible, slow, and humiliating death. Its purpose was not only to kill the body, but to break the spirit of those who remained alive. Hanging was used by the Germans in multiple contexts, as an exemplary punishment against partisans, as a public execution in Jewish ghettos in response to acts of sabotage, or simply as a form of collective retaliation. The SS, the Gestapo, and the occupying forces turned this practice into a form of theatre of death, often staged in squares, factory yards, crossroads, or even at the entrances to concentration camps. The victims were hanged with rough ropes, often from cranes, electricity poles, beams, or trees, while a forced crowd, comrades, neighbors, workers, prisoners, was forced to witness the execution. From a technical standpoint, the most common method was short hanging without free fall. This caused a slow death by strangulation, which could last several minutes. The victims struggled, kicked, gasped, with their eyes bulging and their tongue hanging out. Sometimes they were forced onto a chair or box, which was then kicked away by an SS officer. In other cases, especially in the camps, a mechanical crane lifted the prisoner from the ground by the neck, leaving them suspended in the air like a dying puppet. This form of execution, as brutal as it was symbolic, aimed to strip the individual of all dignity in their final seconds. One of the most famous episodes occurred at the Auschwitz concentration camp on July 19, 1943, when 12 Polish prisoners were publicly hanged in front of more than 10,000 inmates. The motive was the escape attempt of a fellow inmate. The execution took place in the formation yard. The prisoners were forced to line up and watch. The victims were led out one by one. A sign reading, "This is how those who try to escape die," was hung over them, and they were then placed on the improvised scaffold. The silence of those present contrasted sharply with the cries of the condemned. According to witnesses, some shouted, "Long live Poland!" Component placement, others prayed, and one of them spat on an SS man before his head was covered. The execution left a deep mark on the witnesses, not only because of the act itself, but because of the obligation to watch, the implicit threat, and the collective dehumanization. In the Jewish ghettos, hanging was also common. In Warsaw, Krakow, Vilna, and Białystok, the Gestapo and the SS executed those accused of collaborating with the partisans or hiding weapons. The hangings usually took place in the central square or at the entrance gates. Residents were forced to witness the deaths of their leaders, young fighters, rabbis, or doctors. The ropes were left hanging for days as a warning. In some cases, the bodies were not removed until someone from the ghetto dared, at risk to their own life, to take them down and bury them. The intention was clear: to break the will, sow fear, and destroy hope. In concentration camps such as Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and Gross-Rosen, hangings were almost ritualistic. They often took place on Sundays after the morning count and with the mandatory participation of all prisoners. Victims were selected for sabotage, internal resistance, or for arbitrary reasons. A gallows was set up in the middle of the camp, and the camp commandant read aloud the reasons for the execution, often fabricated. One of the most shocking cases was that of the 12-year-old Hungarian boy, a prisoner at Auschwitz, hanged alongside 2 adults as collective punishment. His body, too light, did not die immediately. He writhed, flailing his legs. The hanging lasted more than half an hour. The writer Elie Wiesel, a witness to the scene, recalled it with a lapidary phrase, "Where is God? He is hanging here from this gallows." Psychological perspective, the hangings had a devastating effect. German soldiers and members of the SS in general showed no scruples. For many, it was part of their duty, a bureaucratic act, even a form of morbid entertainment. Some took photos next to the corpses, smiling as if it were a hunt. For the forced witnesses, however, the execution was a direct blow to identity, to community, to the capacity for resistance. Many suffered nervous breakdowns, others fainted. Some tried to look away and were beaten by the guards. Public executions became living lessons in terror, where death was slow and visible and powerlessness absolute. In the occupied territories, especially in Eastern Europe, the Germans also used hanging as a collective punishment. When a German soldier was killed by partisans, the reprisal was usually immediate. The civilian population of the nearest village was gathered, hostages, men, women, even children, were randomly selected, and they were hanged in the town square. In Belarus, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, and Greece, these scenes were frequently repeated. Signs were written reading, "For every German, 10 of you," or "This awaits the saboteurs," and the bodies were left hanging for days. It was a relentless psychological war, where fear became a tool as powerful as weapons. In some cases, the hangings were filmed by the Germans themselves. Films of reprisals in Warsaw or in forced labor camps show the meticulous detail with which these acts were prepared. The carefully placed rope, the indifferent expression of the executioner, the vacant stare of the victim. On other occasions, it was the partisans or survivors themselves who documented the horrors after the liberation, finding bodies hanging from poles or trees, a sign that an exemplary execution had taken place there. The impact of the hangings persists to this day. For many survivors, those moments were the most traumatic of their captivity, not because of the fear of dying themselves, but because of the helplessness of watching a friend, a brother, a mother die. The knot in the rope became a symbol of Nazi brutality, of punishment without trial, of justice as a spectacle. Today, those posts are gone, but their shadows linger in our memories. Remembering the Nazi hangings isn't a morbid exercise, it's an act of justice, because behind every rope was a name, a story, a life taken. And because the executioner's true goal wasn't just to kill, but to make everyone else see it and be silent, and that's why we must continue to speak out. Bayonet executions. During the Japanese occupation of China and the rest of East Asia, particularly between 1937 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army executed tens of thousands of civilians and prisoners using methods of unbridled brutality. One of the most atrocious, and at the same time least explored in Western fiction, was the systematic use of bayonet executions, often carried out not out of military necessity, but as a form of training, collective punishment, or a pure demonstration of power and sadism. Far from being isolated acts, these practices were normalized by Japanese military doctrine and carried out with coldness, cruelty, and even enthusiasm. It wasn't simply a matter of killing with bladed weapons. Prisoners, especially Chinese, were used as living test material. Their hands and feet were tied, they were made to kneel or stand, and they were repeatedly bayoneted while still alive. These weren't always direct stabs to the heart or throat. On the contrary, Japanese soldiers, especially young recruits, were often instructed to practice stabbing different parts of the body, from the abdomen to the base of the neck, without causing immediate death. The goal was to practice the angle of entry, the force of impact, and the speed of withdrawal of the weapon. On other occasions, prisoners were cut in sections, first at the thighs, then at the shoulders, as if they were animals in a butcher shop. Some were held by other prisoners, forced to watch the scene. The sadism reached the point of leaving the mutilated alive, only to have them scream, crawl, or beg, while new batches of soldiers were trained. There were even testimonies from officers who measured the time it took each soldier to kill, timing the efficiency with which the bayonet pierced the human body. In the city of Nanjing, after its fall in December 1937, these practices reached massive levels. The city, invaded by Japanese troops after a vicious campaign, became a laboratory of horror. Thousands of captured Chinese soldiers were executed not by firing squad, but one by one with bayonets. The scenes were of medieval ferocity, bodies dumped on the banks of the Yangtze River, mass pits filled with pierced torsos, severed heads, and limbs torn off with rusty blades. A testimony preserved by American missionaries and Chinese doctors recounts how a group of more than 100 prisoners was lined up on a street. The Japanese soldiers formed two lines, facing each other. Each soldier was to pierce his victim's body with a frontal thrust. If the victim didn't die on the first attempt, he was to repeat the attack. Positions were then exchanged. For hours, in the rain, in a silence broken only by screams of agony, what the officers called regular practice of martial discipline took place. One of the most macabre episodes was the so-called beheading competition between Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, widely documented in Japanese newspapers of the time. It was a competition to see who could kill 100 Chinese prisoners the fastest, using only a katana and bayonet. Each execution was accompanied by a press report as if it were a sports race. Although the episode would later be covered up and the officers executed after the war, the incident revealed a culture where the dehumanization of the enemy was total and where violent death became a spectacle and a source of military pride. In rural China, especially in Shandong and Hunan provinces, massacres have been reported in entire villages where civilians were lined up by the dozens and stabbed in turn. Pregnant women were bayoneted to confirm the sex of the fetus. Children were lifted by their feet and tossed into the air to be skewered mid-flight by laughing soldiers. Elderly people trying to intercede for their families were stabbed slowly in the chest using circular motions to increase the pain. In many cases, the torture did not end with death. The bodies were mutilated, hanged, branded, or thrown into septic tanks as waste. The practice of using prisoners for target shooting was also implemented. In various areas of Manchuria and inland occupied China, Imperial Army soldiers set up improvised training camps where they tied prisoners, civilian or military, to wooden posts or trees and shot them from various distances to test rifles, calibrate scopes, or practice pistol shooting. Sometimes bets were placed on who would hit the eye, the heart, or the stomach first. Some survivors recounted how soldiers would laugh as they practiced shooting at extremities to see how long a person could last before dying from blood loss or shock. Grenades were also thrown at motionless bodies at close range just to observe the effects. Those who witnessed these scenes, whether non-Japanese soldiers, prisoners, civilians, or even some trapped foreigners, described feelings of absolute terror, of a complete loss of meaning. Many Japanese soldiers, especially the younger ones, recounted years later that these experiences had marked them forever. Some vomited after the first murders, others cried silently at night, but most, under threat of punishment and within a culture of fanatical obedience, grew accustomed. It became routine. The prisoner was not human, he was a silhouette, a target, an obstacle. Killing him was not an individual action, but part of the cogwheel of a military machine that devoured everyone equally. There were also those who watched without being able to intervene. Doctors, missionaries, diplomats. Some left chronicles. Dr. Robert Wilson of Nanjing University Hospital described bodies with up to 30 bayonet wounds, women raped and then stabbed in the genitals, children killed with bamboo stakes in their mouths. An American journalist described the smell of dried blood in the streets, the purple puddles and dogs licking open corpses at dawn. Bayonet execution, due to its physical contact, symbolic significance, and deliberateness, was not just a tool of war. It was an act of ritual domination, an assertion of absolute power over the body of another. It represented the fall of all ethical barriers, the triumph of a military doctrine that celebrated cruelty as a virtue. Today, those victims still cry out from mass graves and testimonies. Their bodies were destroyed with cold steel, but their names, their voices, and their pain must continue to be counted. Because the edge of the bayonet didn't just cut flesh, it cut humanity itself. And the only way to respond to that is to remember each of those wounds. Execution by slave labor. During the Third Reich, the extermination of millions of people was not limited to gas chambers, mass shootings, or concentration camps. There was another form of death, slower, more invisible, and deeply dehumanizing: annihilation through slave labor. Unlike immediate executions, this method combined economic exploitation with genocide, leading millions of people, Jews, Slavs, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, homosexuals, and political opponents, to die from exhaustion, hunger, disease, and violence while forced to work in hellish conditions. The idea of annihilation through work, Vernichtung through Arbeit, was explicitly expressed by figures such as Heinrich Himmler and Fritz Sauckel, the Reich's manpower officer. This policy was no accident. The Nazi regime considered certain groups of people to be subhuman, Untermenschen, and to be exploited to death without mercy or assistance. Thus, a system was deployed that combined industrial efficiency with systematic extermination. Millions of people were captured in the occupied territories and taken to factories, mines, agricultural fields, railway facilities, or underground complexes where they were subjected to 12 to 16-hour days without breaks, poorly fed, dressed in rags, and under brutal surveillance. The goal wasn't to rehabilitate them or turn them into useful workers. It was to extract every last ounce of strength before they died. In camps such as Auschwitz, 3-Monowitz, also known as Buna or IG Farben, deportees were forced to work in the construction of chemical plants for the production of synthetic rubber. The IG Farben company actively collaborated with the SS. Slave workers were selected upon arrival. The strongest were sent to labor, the weak and sick directly to the gas chamber. Those deemed useful lasted only a few weeks. They died of exhaustion, circulatory collapse, dysentery, pneumonia, or beatings. Those who collapsed at the workplace were executed on the spot or beaten to death by the kapos. The mines of Mauthausen in Austria were another symbol of labor extermination. There, prisoners had to carry heavy stones up 186 steps, the so-called staircase of death, over and over again for hours. Many died as they fell, were pushed, or simply allowed to collapse. The SS watched from above, amused, betting on who would fall first. Between 1938 and 1945, at least 90,000 people died there. The stone, intended for the regime's projects, was mixed with the bones and blood of those who extracted it. Soviet prisoners were particularly brutal victims. More than 5 million were captured during the invasion of the USSR. Of these, around 3 million died from starvation, exposure, disease, or forced labor. Often they were not even considered worthy of prisoners' uniform. They were left to die in the open air, without food or shelter, or sent to dig ditches, build defenses, or work in extreme weather conditions without tools. They were forbidden to speak, receive letters, or complain. If one of them collapsed, they were shot. If they stole food, they were hanged. Their death was seen as a natural part of the process. In factories such as Daimler-Benz, BMW, Krupp, Siemens, Volkswagen, and Mannesmann, thousands of slave laborers, including children, were employed under direct contract by the SS. These companies profited from the free mass labor, knowing that the prisoners were replaceable. In many facilities, satellite camps were built next to the factories to maintain a steady flow of labor. There were no wages, no rights, and getting sick meant death. In the final years of the war, with Allied bombing and the advance of the Red Army, the Nazis moved many factories underground. In places like Mittelbau, Dora, prisoners worked in hand-dug tunnels to build V-2 missiles. The air was unbreathable, filled with dust, cement, gases, and excrement. There was no sunlight. They died of asphyxiation, tuberculosis, collapsed lungs, and landslides. More than 20,000 people died there, building the weapons of revenge that Hitler promised as a final miracle. One of the most horrendous aspects of this policy was that suffering was instrumentalized, that is, considered an integral part of punishment. Labor didn't just have an economic purpose, it had a moral, punitive component. Jews, communists, and gypsies weren't supposed to just die. They had to suffer before they died. That's why they were kept alive just long enough to continue producing. They were beaten, denied medical care, forced to work with fever, broken bones, and open sores. When they could no longer endure, they were discarded. In many camps, such as Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald, periodic selections were carried out among the workers' ranks. An SS doctor assessed their continued service. A flick of the finger was enough to decide their fate. Those who could still walk were sent back to work. Those who were no longer strong were sent to the crematorium. This inhumane rotation turned the camp into a slow death factory. The psychological effects of this extermination through labor were devastating. The prisoners lived in a permanent state of terror and exhaustion. They rapidly lost weight, their bodies deformed, their minds fractured. Many entered a state of automatism. They no longer spoke, no longer thought. They just walked, carried, fell. Others rebelled inwardly, trying to resist, to survive another day. A few managed to escape or leave a testimony, but the majority died without a name, without a grave, transformed into a number that was crossed off the list and replaced by another. Today, extermination by forced labor remains one of the least remembered forms of Nazi genocide. Yet it was as systematic, as planned, and as devastating as any gas chamber. Millions died, not by fire or bullet, but by the slow, invisible, and planned degradation of their humanity. They were enslaved, exploited, forgotten. To remember them is to give them back what the regime took from them, their dignity, because every carved stone, every assembled missile, every forcibly constructed railway track was a tool of death disguised as production, and every victim, a life sacrificed on the altar of fanaticism and greed, death at the hands of a doctor. The horror of the Holocaust was not limited to extermination camps, slave labor, or mass murder by firing squad or gas. One of the most atrocious and profoundly dehumanizing forms of execution took place inside hospitals, laboratories, and medical barracks, deaths caused by medical experiments. In these places, men, women, and children were tortured under the guise of science. Most did not survive. Those who did suffered lifelong physical and psychological scars. The so-called medical experiments carried out by Nazi doctors and SS officers took place primarily in camps such as Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen, Neuengamme, and Buchenwald, among others. They were presented as scientific research, but in reality they were tests without consent, without anesthesia, and without ethical protocols. The victims were treated as objects. They were mutilated, infected, irradiated, frozen, or poisoned, with no intention of curing or saving them. The goal was not medical advancement, it was savage experimentation as a form of domination, racism, and extermination disguised as medicine. One of the most infamous names linked to these crimes is that of Josef Mengele, a doctor at Auschwitz known as the Angel of Death. Mengele personally selected his victims on the arrival ramp. His obsession with twins led him to experiment with more than 1,000 pairs. He injected chemicals into their eyes to try to change their color. He performed simultaneous amputations to study the body's response. In one of the most disturbing cases, he surgically sewed 2 children together at the back, trying to create Siamese twins. Both died screaming in pain after days of fever and infection. Mengele also experimented with dwarfism, genetic deformities, and multiple pregnancies. Many pregnant women were murdered so their fetuses could be removed and dissected. Survivors remember the bloody gurneys, the smell of burning flesh, the silence of those who could no longer scream. There was no cure, no relief, only scalpels, needles, poisons, and death. At Dachau, another center of these horrors, hypothermia experiments were conducted. The goal was to observe how well the human body could withstand extreme cold, with the supposed purpose of helping Luftwaffe pilots who had fallen into icy waters. Victims were submerged in vats of icy water, often naked, and their time to death was recorded. Sometimes brutal resuscitation attempts were made, scalding showers, rubbing with naked bodies, exposure to ultraviolet lamps. Most did not survive. The screams during these sessions were inhuman, like animal wails. Mourning for the dead was not allowed. The next patient waited in line. At Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp, surgical experiments were carried out with deliberate infections, bone and muscle grafts, and drug trials that were never administered under ethical conditions. Young women were cut open without anesthesia, wood splinters or metal fragments were placed in their bones to simulate war wounds, and their progress was then studied. Some developed gangrene, others were killed when they were no longer useful for observation. Many were maimed for life and were contemptuously called rabbits. At Buchenwald, experiments were conducted with experimental vaccines, contagious diseases, and poisons. Prisoners were inoculated with typhoid, tuberculosis, yellow fever, malaria, hepatitis, and syphilis, sometimes in combination. How their weakened bodies reacted to multiple infections was studied. When their organs collapsed, they were cut open in the operating room, sometimes while still alive, to observe the effects. Poisons were also tested on food and drink. Many died writhing, vomiting blood, losing their sight or control of their organs. Children, especially Jewish, Roma, and disabled children, were recurring victims. At the Neuengamme camp near Hamburg, 20 Jewish children were selected for a tuberculosis experiment. They were injected with active bacteria and then transferred to the Bullenhuser Dam subcamp. There, after suffering for weeks without treatment, they were hanged one by one in a cellar so that there would be no witnesses. They ranged in age from 5 to 12. Another dimension of these crimes was the use of Soviet and Polish prisoners of war as test subjects. Many underwent limb mutilations, organ harvesting, regeneration studies, and chemical weapons testing. Some were locked in rooms with mustard gas or phosgene to see how their lungs reacted to the slow poisoning. They died of asphyxiation, vomiting, and convulsions while notes were taken. The executions carried out through experiments were not collateral. They were deliberate, planned, and documented. Doctors recorded every reaction, every survival time, every collapse. Reports, graphs, and conclusions were drawn. Much of this data was used in subsequent medical projects, generating an ethical dilemma that still persists in modern medicine. The executioners, like the soldiers at the front, received ideological training. They were convinced that those bodies were not human. They were enemies of the Reich, parasites, surplus elements. Therefore, when they cut a muscle or punctured a lung, they felt no guilt. They did it in white coats, with a stethoscope, surgical instruments, and clinical language. It was a science prostituted in the service of extermination. The psychological impact on the survivors was incalculable. Those who lived to tell the tale described not only the physical pain, but also the total loss of trust in humanity. They felt treated like biological waste, like laboratory rats. For decades, many of them remained silent. The trauma was too profound. Some committed suicide years later, unable to live with the memories. Others tried to rebuild their bodies and their lives, but carried the scars on their skin and in their memories. At the end of the war, only a few of these doctors were brought to trial at the Nuremberg trials, specifically the so-called doctors' trial. More than 30,000 direct victims of experiments were documented. However, many perpetrators were never punished. Some Nazi doctors were welcomed by the United States or the USSR into secret scientific development programs such as paperclip. Their blood-stained knowledge served to advance medicine, aeronautics, and pharmacology. Extermination through experiments was the ultimate perversion of knowledge. In the name of science, pain was inflicted, bodies were decomposed, lives were disfigured. It was a surgical genocide, cold, methodical, without bullets or gas, but with scalpels, formulas, and white coats. Remembering it is not just an exercise in memory, it is an eternal warning about what happens when ethics disappear and the human being becomes an object of study and of death. The gas chambers. The gas chambers represent one of the Third Reich's most sinister and meticulously designed instruments of mass murder. They weren't created in the heat of battle or the chaos of occupation. They were conceived, planned, constructed with engineering utter coldness and used with blood-curdling efficiency. Their purpose was one, to kill the greatest number of people in the shortest possible time. And they did it without screams, without gunshots, without blood on the floor, only with gas, darkness, and a slow, desperate collective agony. From the moment deportees arrived at camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec, or Chelmno, they were part of a machinery designed to ensure that death would not disrupt order. They stepped off the train cars after days of overcrowding without food or water. They heard barking, shouts in German, saw uniforms, watchtowers, smoke on the horizon. They were ordered to leave their belongings and form lines, men on one side, women and children on the other. A gesture of a finger, usually from a medical officer like Mengele, determined their immediate fate. The old, the weak, the sick, mothers with children in their arms were led directly to their deaths. The journey to the gas chamber was shrouded in lies. They were told they would be disinfected, that they would be given a shower before entering the camp. They entered a large concrete room, sometimes decorated with mock showers with hangers on the wall and signs in German. They were ordered to strip. Some smiled nervously, others were suspicious, but terror had not yet fully taken hold. The women hid their children in their arms, the men stared at each other, gulping. There was a heavy silence, punctuated by the children's cries and the shouts of the SS men who hastened the process with blows from their batons. Everything had to be done quickly. Then a heavy steel door would open, and they would be pushed into a windowless, sealed, airtight room. The doors would be slammed shut. From outside, handles would be turned, bolts would be locked. Inside, a stifling heat reigned. The air was thick with fear. In some camps, like Treblinka and Sobibor, the gas came from diesel engine exhaust, carbon monoxide, lethal, invisible, odorless. In others, like Auschwitz, Zyklon B, a pesticide based on hydrocyanic acid, was used, introduced in the form of pellets through openings in the roof. Death was not instantaneous. When the first puffs of gas filled the room, screams erupted. Some tried to cover their faces with their clothes, but they were naked. Their lungs burned. They choked, gasped, vomited, urinated, and defecated. Mothers tried to lift their children above the gas, but to no avail. The air became unbreathable. In desperation, many tried to climb over each other, seeking the oxygen that remained higher up. The result was a pyramid of corpses, a human mountain pressed up against the door, bodies intertwined in their final act of desperation. The strongest remained at the top. Below, the children and the elderly, crushed, suffocated, and broken. Eyes became bloodshot, tongues swelled, and fingernails broke against the concrete walls. Fingernail grooves have been found on the walls, silent evidence of the escape attempt. No one escaped. Death occurred within 10 to 20 minutes. Although in cold temperatures, Zyklon B took longer to act. In many cases, more gas was introduced to speed up the process. Once everyone was deemed dead, the Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to assist in the extermination machinery, would open the doors. The air came out thick, unbreathable. The sight was hellish. Bodies piled up, blue, twisted, foaming at the mouth, bloodstains from internal explosions, torsos still warm. They had to work quickly. The bodies were dragged out. They searched for gold teeth. Hair was cut. Vaginas and rectums were checked for any hidden jewelry. It was part of the protocol. Then the bodies were taken to crematoriums or to open pits where they burned for hours. The chamber was cleaned and aired. Within a few hours, it was ready for the next group. Each camp had its capacity. Auschwitz-Birkenau could kill up to 6,000 people a day. Treblinka killed more than 800,000 people in a single year. The system was fine-tuned. The chambers were increasingly larger and more efficient. Some camps, like Majdanek, had several chambers operating simultaneously. The logistics were perfect. Death was routine. The German officers knew everything. Some, like Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, spoke of the process without emotion. They saw it as a technical task. There were reports, balance sheets, gas efficiency tests. They discussed the best time of day to kill depending on the temperature. It was genocide converted into engineering on an industrial scale. Surviving witnesses, especially the Sonderkommando, described the sound of banging on doors, the rising screams, the agonized whispers. They said you never forget the first time, the smell, the heat, the sight of a child clinging to its mother's breast, dead with its eyes still open. Many Sonderkommando committed suicide. Others were murdered so they wouldn't speak. Some left written testimonies and were buried next to the crematoria. These notes were found after the war. The gas chambers were not an accident of the Holocaust. They were its heart. They were designed by architects, built by engineers, overseen by doctors. They were the final point of a system that reduced human beings to numbers, to units of burden. They didn't just kill bodies, they annihilated human dignity, decomposing it with gas, silence, and concrete. Remembering them isn't an act of morbid curiosity, it's a moral necessity. Because millions died there without trial, without names, without graves. And because there, amidst the cement and smoke, the 20th century revealed just how far human beings will go when they decide another doesn't deserve to live.